Hello, you're watching World Talks. My name is Sasha Farbach. A breakthrough on funding, but new friction on reforms. The EU's landmark €90 billion package for Ukraine is back on track after Hungary's political shift. Yet tougher conditions and domestic tensions in Kyiv could complicate delivery. Joining us now to discuss it all further is Hugo Dixon, commentator at large from Reuters. Good to have you with us here on TVP World.
Very nice to be back, Sasha.
Hugo, I know we discussed this in the past about looking at how this loan could work. Is this now mission accomplished?
It's basically accomplished. Obviously, there are issues of conditionality, making sure that the money flows as fast as possible, but also making sure that it's used effectively and that there is not corruption. And obviously, there is tension between these two issues, speed and control. And the fact that we've had this 4 months of a hiatus, because this deal was originally agreed in December, as you know, and then Viktor Orbán decided to block it. So there's been a 4-month hiatus. This has damaged Ukraine's fighting ability, because although they have had enough money more or less to hang on in the last few months, they haven't had enough money to move onto the front foot. So there still are issues about the speed at which this money can get deployed, and it needs to be deployed as fast as possible in order to give Ukraine as much advantage as possible on the battlefield. But I think we can more or less say that the main issues over the 90 billion loan have been dealt with. My main concern is not the 90 billion loan. My main concern is that the European Union now concludes that it has done its job and it can relax. And that is exactly the wrong thing. There is a big danger of complacency, because this 90 billion is not going to last for nearly as long as the European Union thinks it will last, or at least planned for it to last, which was for 2 years. That is not going to be enough for 2 years. And before we know it, we will be back to thinking, where is the next sum of money going to come for Ukraine in order to continue this war? Because this war is going to go on, unfortunately. And unless Europe does what it needs to do, Ukraine could find itself on the back foot again. And so this is why I'm campaigning still for the mobilization of the 210 billion of euros of Russia's frozen assets that are sitting in the EU. And that, I think, is we need to move on to that debate again and explain how we can do that in a better way than was conceived of last December, when it was last tried and failed.
I want to ask you on that, many different threads here, but as you said, because part of that 90 billion loan that's gone ahead now, that's also built on the backstop of certain Russian assets. They won't be seized, but this is part of the equation. Now, I remember talking to you about this, and I'm just curious, does this, well, you talked about complacency, but does this 90 billion now, let's say, figure as a first stop in trying to now, as an argument, seize the Russian assets that you just mentioned? Is this going in that direction, or is that too early to tell?
The 90 billion loan contains some language about how the European Union reserves the right to use the Russian assets in order to repay the loan if Russia doesn't pay reparations to Ukraine. So there is a nod in the direction of using the Russian assets for this loan, but it is a rather thin and not a very there's not a lot of legal language about it, and there are not very many steps towards making it happen. And as you remember, Sasha, because we discussed this last time, is that the reason why the so-called reparations loan failed in December, which was to use those Russian assets more directly to fund financial help for Ukraine, was because most of them are sitting in Belgium, in Euroclear, which is a clearinghouse in Belgium. And Belgium is a relatively small European economy, and it felt threatened by Moscow, but also by Washington, which wants to use those Russian assets for its own purposes. And so Belgium felt exposed, and it wasn't willing to go ahead with this reparations loan unless there was a whole series of indemnities and support from the other European Union countries. And at the end of the day, the other European Union countries, or at least some of them, weren't prepared to provide those guarantees. And that's why that particular plan fell apart. But so there's still quite a long way to go before we can mobilize these 210 billion euros of Russia's assets in order to help Ukraine. But my concern is that the 90 billion euros will run out. And you have to remember also that Vladimir Putin's coffers are filling up again. His war chest is filling up again because of the war in Iran, which has pushed up oil prices, which is Russia's main source of revenue. And so what's happened is, although Ukraine is fighting extremely hard and well and bravely on the battlefield, the financial equation has shifted in Vladimir Putin's favor, and he will believe that he's going to win a war of attrition. And so Europe needs to shift the balance back in Ukraine's favor. And my concern is that even though we've dealt with the Hungarian problem after the election of Magyar and the loss of Viktor Orbán, there are 27 European Union countries, and they each have an electoral cycle. And it's like playing Russian roulette with a gun with 27 chambers in it. And each time you fire, there's a risk that you will elect a far-right nationalist in one of these 27 countries who will then make life difficult and probably won't be supportive of Ukraine and might be supportive of Vladimir Putin. And of course, the big risk that we have is next year's French presidential election, which is quite likely to bring in the Front National, in the far right party in France, into the French presidency to replace Emmanuel Macron. And so my concern is that there is at the moment a lot of satisfaction among European Union leaders that they have done what they have needed to do with the 90 billion loan. But that's exactly the wrong message. If we don't take advantage of this window of opportunity with the Hungarian election to move on to the front foot and to mobilize these Russian assets to help Ukraine, there is a danger that that window will snap shut, and that in 6 months or 9 months' time, or perhaps a year's time, that Ukraine will be back on the back foot again, and we will regret that we did not take action when we had the moment to do so.
But at the same time, when you're saying about regretting taking action, let's go back to the first thing that you said at the beginning about certain conditions tied to some of this money. And some of that is tied to tax reform in Ukraine. I believe something like 10 or almost 10 billion euros to exactly that amount. Looking also at tax reform for small businesses, I think it concerns VAT, adding, I think, 20%. Right now it's 5%. How realistic is that? I mean, given that some of these businesses are currently in fragile condition, it's wartime, how realistic are those kind of conditions on tax reform right now for Ukraine?
I think that what you're talking about, but maybe I'm not on top of the details, but I think what you're talking about is some of the conditions on the IMF program.
Yeah, on terms of the two of them.
Is
Yeah.
also Yeah, because they both got conditions. Both the European Union loan and the IMF loan have conditions attached to them. And it's true that some of the conditions that the Ukrainian government agreed as part of the IMF loan are extremely difficult for them to deliver politically at home. And so what they are trying to do is to persuade the IMF to give them some slack. Now, my own view is that it's of course extremely difficult because these are international organizations and they have rules. But I think that the IMF should be willing to cut Ukraine some slack, even though that would mean varying a program that the Ukrainian government itself agreed to. But I think you have to accept some of the political realities in terms of the fiscal the difficulties and the financial difficulties that small businesses suffer inside Ukraine. Where I would not cut slack is on the conditions to do with corruption. I think that conditions designed to limit corruption are absolutely vital. We all know that there's a lot of corruption in Ukraine, and that this is not just something that damages Ukraine's long term future and its potential, and I hope probable eventual membership of the European Union. What it also does is it damages the current war. Because one thing that undermines the morale of the ordinary people of Ukraine more than almost anything else is when they see powerful people lining their own pockets. So I think that we need to distinguish these two different types of conditionality and make a distinction, giving some slack for the financial conditionality, but not the corruption conditionality.
Fair point there. And also, I think just looking at the main scope of this, a lot of this is going to be slated from the 90 billion EU loan for military expense, I think 60% of it. Looking, though, if we can tell just briefly now, how quickly do you think all of this will finally really make an impact directly that Ukraine can build the weapons, buy the weapons it needs? How long will that translate into tangibles?
Well, I mean, the European Commission has said that the first money could flow this quarter, so that's by the end of June, so that's 2 months, but that's not going to be large sums. I think that the second half of the year we'll start to see significant amounts of money flowing. But as I said before, that's sort of 4 to 6 months later than it should have been. So we're always in the European Union risk of doing rather little, rather late. And this is why I want to come back to the point that as well as finalizing and getting the 90 billion flowing, we need to move immediately onto the much bigger sum, the 210 billion of the Russian assets. And the first step of that should be to transfer the Russian account away from Belgium to the European Union. We need the Russian transfer. As soon as you do that and you take Belgium out of the firing line, then you open up the way to move forward to use this bigger sum of money at a later stage, but not too late, to actually change the situation. That could be a game changer. So we need to move on to that and not just think we have done the job. We have not done the job.
All right, so still much work ahead. Really interesting insights there. Thanks. Always a pleasure having you. Hugo Dixon there, commentator at large from Reuters. Thank you. And thank you for watching. That concludes World Talks, but stay right here on TVP World for more. Goodbye.